So now I just want to invite Professor Malone and Dean Nobles back to the stage so we can do the Q&A part of tonight's event.
So, as Vice President Zubers explains, we'll be using the Poll Everywhere app to collect your questions. So please use your mobile device to share your questions with me, Harini, and Tom at the URL you see on the screens. And while your questions are coming in, I think I'd like to start with a question of my own. So Tom, we often hear people speculate about whether or not AI and computers are going to take over the world. But the question that is more tangible for our alumni and friends here in Atlanta is this: are AI-driven tools and processes going to take away people's jobs?
Great question, one that I suspect many people in this room are worried about. What I'd like to say first is that I think we should all relax a little bit about this question. The reason I think that is because people have worried about machines taking away jobs and destroying employment for at least hundreds of years, since the Luddites in the 1800s of England. And every single time they've worried about it, jobs have gone away with technology, but at least as many new jobs have been created as were destroyed. Is it theoretically possible that this time will be different? Yes, I think it's theoretically possible, but not very likely. To give you one sense of why I think that's going to happen, let me give you an example about a previous technology called the printing press. The printing press destroyed the jobs of scribes who spent their days copying text from one page to another. But by making it so much cheaper, faster, and easier to copy printed material, the printing press made it economically feasible to create and distribute many, many more kinds of printed material, not just a few very important books, but also novels, magazines, newspapers, comic books, and on. And to create and distribute all these different kinds of printed material, you needed not only typesetters and printing press operators, you needed newspaper reporters and novelists and editors and newspaper delivery people and bookstore owners and on and on and on. So even though it's not always easy to imagine exactly what the new jobs will be, I think it's very likely that something similar will happen with computers. The one last thing to say, by the way, is even though I think we shouldn't worry about long-term unemployment of massive amounts of our population, I think we should worry some about the people whose jobs will be destroyed. And some of those people may not be able to find new jobs at all or jobs that are appropriate. And we do need to worry about what we can do for them. But I think that's a much more tractable problem than the horrible specter of massive numbers of people being unemployed indefinitely.
That's for sure, and it sounds as if part of what it seems to be an important role the government can play in that regard. It sounds in thinking about citizens who will be thrown out of their work immediately.
Yes.
Thank you. So are you all sending questions, or are we having a technical problem? Because I'm not getting too many on my screen here. Folks, can you help me out here? Nothing is coming up. Well, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask.
Can I just ask one while they're waiting?
You certainly can.
Yeah. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday about things like facial recognition. Even if you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, they're learning about you, et cetera. And machine learning, of course, accelerates the opportunity to do things like that. If you go to a protest about something, do you have any ideas about this interface with privacy versus trying to achieve higher productivity or something through machine learning?
Sorry, so was your question with respect to?
Privacy aspects of machine learning, whether it's through what I do on Facebook or through facial recognition. If I put some pictures of myself on Facebook, or I go to the Department of Motor Vehicle, then if I'm at a protest, maybe I'm protesting white supremacists, then through machine learning, they're able to say, who am I
Yeah, I completely agree with like what you're saying with respect to being concerned about privacy. And I mean, it's something that we worry about with the healthcare application as well, with like, you don't know, like you're getting healthcare data collected about you all the time, and who knows what machine learning model that's going to end up in. With facial recognition, I think it's particularly tricky because it's so easy to just recognize someone from a photograph of you on the internet that you have no idea is being analyzed. So I think there's no clear answer to this, right? Because on one hand, there's a lot of research recently about how current facial recognition algorithms are sort of biased in the types of faces that they can recognize. And so on one hand, you want to be able to collect more data to make them better. But then on the other hand, by making them better, you're only making them better at potentially bad applications. So it's a really tricky dilemma. And I think that, like, I don't have a perfect answer, but one thing that I think is really necessary is for the people developing these tools to sort of step back for a second, like take a pause, stop. And in fact, there's a facial recognition bill in Massachusetts. There's this bill that they're pushing for a moratorium on facial recognition technology development. And I think some things like that are really important, where typically I think computer scientists or sort of technologists have sort of considered these issues separate, where it's like, I'll just keep doing it and then someone else will figure out whether or not it's like a good thing. But I think it needs to be more of like back and forth conversation where everyone is involved and we sort of collectively decide, okay, this is like not a technology that we're going to continue developing because the harm that it can impose is so much more than whatever benefit we might get. So, yeah.
Tom, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. I was in an event yesterday where we talked about some very similar issues, and I think one thing that's useful to think about this is to look at it from a much higher level point of view. The analogy I used in the event yesterday is, think about what happened when hunting and gathering lifestyle was replaced by an agricultural or agrarian lifestyle. Some things really changed, like ownership of land didn't really even mean anything to hunter-gatherers. It would have been silly to say, well, I own this land and you own that one, because everybody could go everywhere. But in order for our agricultural society to work, we had to develop and create sort of legal and other ways of enforcing the concept of ownership of land. I think one way of dealing with a lot of the privacy issues that we worry about is to think of it as a similar kind of property rights issue. You might say, for instance, that I share ownership of any data created when I'm involved in interaction with you, and both of us have to some way agree about any other uses of that data. I'd have a property right, you might have to pay me or give me some other economic benefit to have the rights, the legal rights, to use the information you created in that interaction. Is that exactly the right answer? I don't know, but I think we need to be thinking at that level of generality to come up with really potentially profoundly different ways of solving this problem.
One other thing I'd like to add is, Harini, you were describing how technologists may think about, computer scientists are thinking about developing these technologies and worrying about the consequences later in a way, and it seems as if that's certainly some of what we're thinking about teaching our students not to do, right? So the workshop that Abby Jakes developed and certain of our new classes on the ethics of technology are designed to get exactly this, that at every step in which students are thinking about these issues, they have to think about the ethical and social implications from the start and at the beginning and throughout. And so it seems to me that what the state of Massachusetts is dealing with is exactly what we hope our students will be able to deal with in the classroom in a thoughtful way. So I've got some more questions here, both for Harini and Tom. So here's one I think both of you may think about, and in fact, I think certain of your answers may have already touched on certain parts of it. What does accountability look like for companies in the machine learning space? What should we be demanding?
Yeah, so I think one big thing is just sort of transparency in a way, because a lot of times I think that the like machine learning algorithms are sort of producing all sorts of content that we see, or they're sort of embedded in all kinds of apps that we use, but we don't really know that. And so I think the first thing is just like whenever you're using one of these things, you should know that you're using it, and then also be able to sort of interrogate what it's doing. Like, what data was this thing trained on? Like, is it actually good at what I'm trying to use it for? Like, is it meant for this? Like, what was it actually intended to do, and why am I, just sort of basic questions like that can kind of help the user then start to gauge whether this is something that they actually want to be using, or, and maybe it is, but just maybe not in this particular scenario. I think that that sort of information is really helpful for people to sort of develop a nuanced understanding of when and when not they should be relying on things like this.
So my quick answer would be accountability in the age of machine learning means the same thing as accountability always meant. That is, you're responsible for the accuracy, the reliability, the trustworthiness, the potential bias. You're responsible for everything you do as a company, whether that's done by humans or by machines or by some combination. And there are some things that are a little different about machine learning, sometimes harder to explain what it does, though it's also often hard to explain what people do. And
that's for sure.
Machines can be biased, and so can people. And so I think in some ways, it's just the same old problem, but with some more details different.
So Tom, here's a question for you. How do you see hyper-connected human computer groups emerging in human-intensive public realms, such as the justice system? What are the barriers we need to overcome by incorporating computers into these groups?
Okay, this may have been asked by someone who actually read my book, Superminds, because I had in there a scenario of how we might actually use human-computer superminds in the criminal justice system. Actually, let me take a show of hands. Are any of the rest of you in this room fans of the Michael Connelly crime novels? I'm blanking on the name. Are there some hands up? I'm blanking on the name of the detective. Does someone remember it? Harry Bosch. Oh, yes, Harry Bosch. Any other fans of Harry Bosch in here? Okay, so I wrote a multi-page scenario of how Harry Bosch might be able to use and what he might think of a new kind of supermind for doing crime detection. What if you had vast amounts of data about all the crimes that had ever been committed, not only in your own jurisdiction, but maybe all over the country? What if you had online records of all the interviews and all the evidence and everything that had happened in a case? At some level, that might be kind of like what Harry Bosch does already with his murder books, as he calls them. But I think where it gets really interesting is when the system can learn over time, when the system can begin to recognize patterns in certain kinds of crimes done by certain kinds of people in certain kinds of locations or other circumstances. And when it can start to initially just give some suggestions to the detectives. And over time, some of those suggestions might be always taken by the detectives, and then they might not even have to worry about it. They might just kind of take it for granted. That's what I call a cyber-human learning loop. Over time, I think the whole system could get smarter and smarter, not because computers would take over the job of a detective, but because they'd act more and more, in this case, as partners and tools, and together, the justice system could potentially get smarter and smarter.
Okay. That's reassuring in a certain way, I think. But here's a question that kind of gets to maybe the underside of that, and it's directed to Harini, but both of you can think about it. So, Harini, can you provide examples of the kinds of unintended biases you have found in machine learning?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if this question is specifically referring to issues of trust or just like generally unintended biases.
It says unintended biases.
Okay, yeah, a lot of them. So one thing that I worked on in the past couple of years is sort of coming up with a framework for ways that, for sources of such downstream harm in a machine learning system. So to give a couple examples, one that I'm sure we're all familiar with at this point is just simply historical bias, like bias historically marginalized groups are historically marginalized in our data sets, and then when we train models to recognize patterns in our data sets, they will sort of pick up on those patterns. So that's a huge one that I think we're grappling with right now. But then there's also sort of like other more sort of tricky ones, like if the model that you're using is just too simple for the diversity of the data that you have, that can also sort of introduce a bias where the model just fits to the majority group because it doesn't really have the computational power to model differences in your data. So there's things like that arise also. And I think there's things throughout the entire machine learning pipeline. In the evaluation stage, if you're sort of benchmarking models, benchmarking different models on a benchmark data set that's not really balanced, it can appear like all your models are doing really well when really they're just doing well on what's in this benchmark data set. And that's happened for a lot of machine learning developments recently. A typical way that you sort of show success is by showing your performance on one of these benchmark sets. And so I think it's really important from that angle that we pay attention to sort of building out a set of benchmark data sets. And that's a different problem than the historical data, but they're all kind of related. And so, yeah, and then of course these issues of trust that I talked about earlier today, where you did your model, you did your evaluation, you did all of that, but now you put this thing into the world and it's simply being used in ways that you perhaps didn't expect. That can also lead to sort of unintended harm. So.
Thank you.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay.
I don't have anything to add. Good answer.
Oh, okay. I have a question for you, Tom, though. So both you and Harini talked about the importance of ensuring that AI technologies help humans make better decisions and complete analysis or our tasks more efficiently. Are there AI technologies that help our governments be more intelligent and efficient?
I like the way they laughed at that question.
I want to see how you answer this one.
So my answer is, yes, there are lots and lots of AI technologies that could help governments be more efficient, analyzing big data, helping to analyze decisions, and on and on and on. I think the big question here is not whether AI could be helpful, but whether the human superminds that make up our governments will recognize and actually accept the ways that they could be helped by these technologies. So it's really, in this case, I think, more a human question than a technology question.
Right. That's one thing. We can't get around it about ourselves when thinking about self-governance. So China's different viewpoint of privacy, both of you all can think about this one. China's different viewpoint of privacy in being able to collect a lot of data, which improves AI technology, allows them to grow in AI understanding fast. Does that mean that the US will be left behind?
You're looking at both of us?
Yeah, I am. And I don't see a lot of takers, but.
Well, I think the premise of the question is that since China as a country is less concerned about privacy than we are,
Correct.
their AI algorithms have access to lots more data, and therefore they can learn a lot faster than
Right,
ours.
technology develops.
That in some sense we're handicapped by our concerns about privacy.
I think that's right.
I think at a kind of first level analysis, I think the argument makes sense. It is possible that they'll be able to learn more because of that. But I think the real story is much more complicated. You know, I think there are lots of things going on in the comparison between the two countries, the two cultures. You know, I think there are lots of things that affect how fast a technology develops besides just the availability of data. There are lots of things that affect, you know, how different cultures and economies compete with each other. So I think this story is far from over. And I don't think I know how it's going to come out. Maybe somebody else in the room does.
Thank you. So Harini, terms like AI, big data, machine learning are often used as buzzwords and used by people that don't necessarily understand their exact meaning. In addition to the machine learning tip examples that you shared, how do you suggest engaging the general public in education on these technologies?
Yeah, I mean, that is something that Natalie and I, who I'm making these videos with have been thinking about a lot. And so we, the videos are one thing that we've started, and we want to make a lot more of them, but we're also thinking about ways to sort of other things we can do, so other forms of media that we can use to sort of engage people in topics like this. So one thing that we've thought of beyond just like watching a video is sort of doing interactive exercises, or having like a written things like easy to understand books or things like that. But I mean, it's not, I think it's tricky because there's a risk of oversimplifying the concept to a fault in a way. And so I think it requires a lot of thought. I don't think it's easy, but I think that it's definitely possible. And so I mentioned that we ran this study with people. Some of them came in knowing nothing about machine learning, and then they came out being able to sort of describe in basic terms what it was. So I think it's promising. I don't know if that really answered the question, but I guess what I'm saying is I think we just have to put more effort into it.
Yeah, that's fine. Yes.
So I'll add something if we're allowed to plug our own work here.
Have at it.
Two of the people in the room tonight came up to me and said they had already seen the online executive education course that I was a faculty co-director for, called Artificial Intelligence Implications for Business Strategy. And we have another relatively new course called Machine Learning in Business. So we've tried in both of those courses to address not a technical audience trying to learn how to program or actually implement machine learning, but an audience of business people who just need to know kind of enough about what the technology is, what it can do, what it can't do, to make effective use of it in business. So I think that's another way of learning about the technology kind of from a somewhat different perspective.
Great. So here's a question for the two of you. How do you think liability comes into play when an AI algorithm provides data to a human that ultimately makes a decision impacting financial, civil, or liability associated with the decision?
So the way the question was asked, the human ultimately made the decision. So I think in that sense, it's pretty clear, both legally and from my point of view, ethically, that the human is responsible. The human may be using bad tools, but I think the human bears the ultimate responsibility. I think the question gets more complicated and kind of more interesting when the machine is acting in an autonomous way. Like if it's an autonomous car, or imagine some years from now you have robot security guard that shoots somebody and kills them. I did talk a little bit about this in my book, and I think there's some interesting, I think basically we need to develop new laws to take these things into account. And there's one interesting precedent that I thought found very intriguing, which is the laws about animals. Apparently, at least in some states, I believe it may be true widely in the United States, that if you have a cat or a dog, like a typical household pet, and they do something harmful to another person, like bite them or something, you're only legally responsible for the damages if you were negligent in the way you took care of the dog or the cat, whatever it is. On the other hand, if you have a tiger as a household pet, that's a different category of thing.
Right.
And merely owning a tiger and letting it walk around in a city makes you liable for any damage that the tiger causes. So I think we'll need to develop our legal system to be clearer about how responsibilities apply in different cases like this.
Do you want to add to that, Harini?
Yeah, and I think that sort of basically agreeing with what you said, I think there's a lot of space for more action from a regulatory sense. So some of my work in the past has been in clinical machine learning, so building algorithms to suggest what interventions a patient in a hospital should get and things like that. And I see no reason why that type of stuff shouldn't be held to the same standard as like any drug that's approved or any medical treatment that's approved. And right now, it's not really the case, but I think it's it's something that could happen and should happen as well. And so, yeah.
Great, thank you. We've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you all for your stimulating questions. And now join us for our coffee and dessert reception. Thank you very much. Okay.